I used to tell students that you should think of yourselves as being stewards in radiating circles of sympathy. I hope they are all blessed with spouses and children, and that would be the thing they would pay attention to first. You think of yourself first as a member of your family. After that, maybe you radiate outward to your block. I am a member of this block. Then it's neighborhood, then it's city, then it's state. Only then does it become the United States of America.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Johnny Burtka and Tom Saroof. Today we are joined by our very own McKay Stangler. McKay is our Director of Foundation Relations at ISI. After earning a PhD with a dissertation on Richard Weaver, he worked as a college professor for 5 years, where he saw firsthand just how critical ISI's mission is for educating today's students and faculty members. He then joined the world of development and advocacy, serving on the fundraising team of a small Catholic college in Kansas City. A lifelong bird nut, Stangler then served as Director of Development for Audubon of Kansas and Development Officer for the American Bird Conservancy, raising funds for threatened bird species throughout the Americas. Based in suburban Kansas City with his wife and 2 children, McKay spends his free time fly fishing and bird watching. Welcome to the podcast, McKay.
Thank you. I'm honored and flattered and very pleased.
We're honored to have you as well. I actually didn't know that you were a fly fisherman, so we might have to ask you about that as well. But before we dive into the interview, I wanted to thank all our listeners for tuning into Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Our mission at ISI is to educate for liberty. If you'd like to join us in pursuing that mission, please be sure to rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Well, McKay, before we dive into Richard Weaver, which is really the heart of what we wanted to talk with you about, I wanted to hear a little more about your experience as a college professor. Why did you feel initially that vocation, the draw to be a teacher, to be a professor? And then what did you discover once you were inside of the academy that made you want to get out and eventually come to work for an organization like ISI?
Yeah, I got into academia because I love to read and I love to write, and higher education is an incredibly important part of American culture. And I thought that I would be a research professor and write these, highfalutin articles forever. And it turns out, people often ask me, our fellow conservatives, they say, are things as bad as I hear they are in higher ed? And I always say it's so much worse. It's so much worse because you tend to hear about the explicit things. So-and-so speaker got canceled. This person got deplatformed. But the much more troubling aspect of what's going on in higher ed are the quiet things, the chilling effect, the students and faculty afraid to say what they believe. I was at one of our events, Johnny, in St. Louis a few nights ago, and I told some friends of ISI that the moment that I knew things had gotten really bad came at the very end of my time in academia, but even at the very beginning. I remember assigning a chapter of Hemingway to some students in my very first semester because we were talking about how to write in a way that mimics how speech actually works. And I had a female student come up to me after class and say that she wanted to file a complaint because I had done violence to the students. And I said, I'm so sorry to hear that. What happened? And she said, well, Hemingway was a misogynist. And I said, yeah, he surely was. And she said, well, by exposing us to that, you've done violence to us. You've made us feel unsafe. And I, was very apologetic. And I said, he was a monster in his personal life, but so was Picasso. But that doesn't mean that these aren't incredibly important cultural figures whose work we need to discuss. And I remember, this is the crucial part. I remember coming home to my wife and laughing and saying, boy, are these kids in for a rude awakening when they hit the real world. And I would never have expected a decade later that the real world would comport to that view, that the world of trigger warnings and safe spaces and speak your truth would come to dominate American culture and higher ed at large. And then at the end of my time in academia, It was just the levels of groupthink were Stalin-esque in the extreme. We hear a lot, as we know, about diversity and equity and inclusion on higher education, in higher ed and on campuses, but there is no intellectual diversity to speak of in a meaningful way. You can get 10 people in a room on faculty and in a classroom representing 10 different ethnicities, races, nationalities, and they're all going to believe the same thing. So it ends up this terribly homogenized world at most campuses. And that's why the work of ISI and our peer institutions is so essential, because we are stressing that there is a full spectrum of ideas in the American founding and throughout American history and through the tradition of Western Civ. And those ideas deserve to be shared with students and openly debated. And free exchange of ideas is what makes this country significant on the world stage. So I knew that I had hit a point when I was the outlier in too many situations, and there were too many situations sort of peers, faculty peers, knocking on the office door and saying, "I can't help but notice you don't have a Black Lives Matter sign on your door." Sort of a Workers of the World Unite, nice shop you have here. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. So that was the end of it for me.
McKay, just a quick follow-up on that. One, would you mind sharing, what type of school you were teaching at? And I've sometimes heard it said that, it's the Ivy Leagues and the big kind of top state schools where there's real problems. And, if you go to one of these smaller regional colleges, you're generally okay. Is that true in your experience?
No, I have not found that to be the case. There's a very fascinating split. I taught at 3 colleges, a small Catholic college founded for immigrants, where the students were too focused on finding a living wage to be concerned with wokeness. And then at Berry College in Georgia, where I was very fortunate to work with Peter Lawler, a friend of ISI, who is dearly missed. And then most of my teaching was at the University of Kansas, so a flagship state school. And the fascinating split there is I taught 2 groups of students. I taught in our honors program, which is sort of the best of the best of students at KU. A lot of these kids were people who maybe got accepted to Ivies, but their families couldn't afford it, and they got this full ride at a state school, so they came there. And then I taught, for lack of a better word, the regular students, the non-honor students. And almost to a T, the non-honors students were hardworking, and they came from more working class backgrounds. They were very open-minded. They were interested in learning. They did not care that much about identity politics. The honors program students, the children of physicians, attorneys, what we think of as the cognitive elite in the United States, they were the ones who had grown up wealthier and were utterly consumed by identity politics and wokeness on campus. So it's this very fascinating split where you would see the children of the elite coming to a campus and the ones, reminding each other to, you need to check your privilege when you say that. Whereas the regular students were much more concerned with, I'm here to learn, I am open-minded, I want to get my degree and improve my life. So no, I did not find any campus that was totally devoid of this stuff. It is bad everywhere.
I just know, before we turn to Richard Weaver, just one point I would say is, as a student, I found that to be the case. And I went to Boston College, which I guess would fall into the more elite level universities, but the same sort of thing of a lot of racial and ethnic diversity, but there's absolutely no diversity of opinion. And I know, as an ISI student, ISI honors scholar, and now someone on staff, I've learned more in the last year debating with my colleagues in a spirit of open inquiry and sort of trying to get to truth than I did at a place where they said there is no truth to be found, or there's facts and then there's your values. And so whatever your values are, sort of whatever delusions you'd like to believe, that will still let you believe. But on that point, I think that's maybe a good segue to go to Richard Weaver. Can you sort of situate him a little bit in historical context and the time in which he was writing, and give us sort of a 10,000-foot overview of his life, his work?
Yeah, so Richard Weaver, there's a terrific Weaver quote about the Southern Agrarians, the people who trained him, and he said, "We are provincials. We have our names on the land." And in his case, this is literally true because he was born in Weaverville, North Carolina, which is now a sort of a suburb of Asheville, but at the time was a little bit removed from Asheville. And he was born there and is in fact buried there. And I visited his grave last year. He is born in 1910 to a man who worked at a livery stable and a woman who worked at a millinery. And at age 5, his father dies and they move to Lexington, Kentucky. He matriculates through a private school there, goes to the University of Kentucky, where he is a well-known socialist and is involved with American Socialist Party activities and was sort of an agitator. And he graduated and did a master's degree where he studied under John Crow Ransom, and he starts to get involved at Vanderbilt and the Southern Agrarians, and then began a dissertation in English literature at Vanderbilt, writing a dissertation on Milton, but he comes from a very poor background and has to go get a job to send money home to his mother. He was a very devoted son and family member. In fact, his whole life, he would go back to Weaverville in the summers to attend family reunions, and he gave these little speeches about the decline of culture while he was there. I'm not sure how good a party guest he was, but so he goes to teach at what is now Texas A&M, what is now Auburn, and ends up abandoning his Milton dissertation and applies to a new doctoral program at LSU to study under Cleanth Brooks, the great new agrarian and Southern agrarian and new critic. He calls himself a Southern nationalist in his application, and he goes and later he says he converted to the Church of Agrarianism, and so you have this wonderful intellectual tradition of John Crow Ransom, Alan Tate, Donald Davidson, Cleanth Brooks, and they completely shape Weaver's thinking and convince him of the importance of language and the importance of connecting terms to Platonic transcendentals that underlie language. And he bums around for a few years, spent some time at Harvard and the Sorbonne in programs, summer programs, and ends up at the University of Chicago as a faculty member in the mid-40s. But we should stress he taught in the undergraduate, the College of the University of Chicago, which at the time was not as prestigious as we would think of it today. And he has a very onerous teaching load, but he finds time to write at midday every day, starts publishing essays, was an early author in a journal we know called Modern Age, becomes friends with Russell Kirk, and in 1948 publishes the book that most people probably know him best for, which is Ideas Have Consequences. He wanted to call it The Adverse Dissent, but University of Chicago Press went with Ideas Have Consequences, which it turns out to be a kind of a crucial concept for conservatives, so I think it's okay. And really takes off from there. He becomes an intellectual star in conservatism, is given a major award about a decade later at a Young Americans for Freedom conference, turns his attention to the South, starts publishing essays about the South in Georgia Review, Southern Review, Sewanee Review, and acquired this weird reputation for being hermetic and almost monastic, sort of a lonely scholar toiling by candlelight, which is really just, no one's sure where that came from because he was very well known for attending faculty parties. He was known to love a glass of whiskey. He would bring different female guests to parties, so no one's quite sure how he acquired this reputation. And he finally, in a career pinnacle, he is offered a position to join the faculty at Vanderbilt, coming home essentially. He accepted the job and just days later died of a heart attack in his sleep at just age 53 in 1963. So he was tragically cut short, did not enjoy the long lifespan that someone like a Russell Kirk had. But in that time was very influential and left enough material behind for 4 posthumous collections. So was just an astonishingly prolific writer who was very influential within a sort of small world of intellectual conservatism.
McKay, that's fascinating history. I'm wondering for our listeners if you could explain some of the core ideas in the Southern agrarian tradition and maybe emphasize the ones that Weaver in particular picked up in his work.
Yeah, there are 3 in particular. One is the idea of practice, that there are 2 realms of knowledge coming out of ancient Greek thought. techne and phronesis. Techne being something like technical knowledge, craft, phronesis being practical knowledge or accumulated wisdom. The classic example here is you go down to a dock to go on a boat, and there are two sailboat captains. And one is a young person who has read every single book about sailing ever published, but has never set foot on a boat. The other is a completely illiterate gentleman who has never read a book, but has been sailing for 50 years. And the question is, whose boat would you rather go on? And of course, we would all say the guy who's been sailing for 50 years. But he has the accumulated wisdom, the inherited knowledge that comes from being situated in a particular culture. A lot of overlap here with someone like a Michael Oakeshott, who would say that techne can tell you what to do, but only phronesis or practical judgment can tell you why to do it or how to do it. And the other would be, the second one would be place. The agrarians, as you might expect, firmly devoted to the idea of place in shaping who we are, place-based culture. People can only come together when they see each other. The legacy of this would be someone like a Wendell Berry embodies this specifically. And the third one would be solidarity. That solidarity and fellow feeling with citizens is the most important thing that a culture can aim for. And they saw those ideas as emerging from the Old South, which they saw as a direct heir to sort of an aristocratic European culture. They were no great fans of the North, of course, which they saw as industrial and harried, and applying what they would call the applied tools of science to all questions, whereas the South was the place where a man could contemplate his status in the world and see his name on the land and pass on knowledge to his children. Obviously, a lot of those ideas about the Old South will fall a little uncomfortably on our ears. But Weaver was devoted to the idea that, along with Eliot and Faulkner, that the idea is not to recreate the past, but to recover ideas from the past that are worth maintaining and nurturing in our time. So those three elements, practice, place, and solidarity, are probably the three things he picked up on the most from the Southern agrarians.
Honing in on place a little bit, one of the things that we've talked about a lot on this podcast is the idea of sort of the frontier thesis. So maybe the North is focused on sort of scientific knowledge, the South place and sort of contemplation. But the West sort of like picking up your roots instead of rootedness, picking up your roots and starting ever anew, and sort of pushing the boundaries. That's where I sort of think you get like the idea of like rugged individualism, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Your destiny is yours, what you make of it. It sounds maybe like those two things are in tension. So I know what Weaver would say about like the idea of the frontier thesis and the sort of spirit of exploration and becoming that it embodies.
Yeah, I think tension for sure. And Weaver would probably be deeply skeptical. He was skeptical of a lot of things. The media, jazz. He was no great fan of jazz. Yeah, that's a great point. There's a wonderful George Santayana quote that Americans don't solve problems, they leave them behind. And that's sort of the bad side of the frontier thesis. But that's one of the tough things about the U.S. is the frontier. The idea of the frontier is bound up with this idea that we create our own world, we make ourselves anew every day, things that would be very hostile to a lot of conservatives, leaving tradition behind. We make our own destiny, but at the same time, those are also animating forces that underlie the success of our nation. And so it's probably the tension that you're speaking of, which is accurate, and Weaver would dislike it and did dislike it. Those are also the things that make our country what it is. And so it would be one of those places where we would say the agrarians are probably too wedded to the idea of staying rooted in place, sort of a Jeffersonian yeoman farmer thing. But yes, I think the tension is there for sure.
McKay, I'm curious, the Southern intellectual tradition post, what does that look like today, if you're looking in the South? Like, can we find any remnants of it? I know, thinking after the Civil War, I'm sure Weaver was, to some extent kind of maybe even a last vestige of sort of this Southern thought. And you see a little bit in Russell Kirk, kind coming out in ways that you probably wouldn't see it in contemporary conservative thinkers. But, when I think of the South today, and I actually do, I love going to the South because I do appreciate the communal culture, but I think of things that I have also defended, but that are much more aspects of mass culture. So when I think of the South, I think of college football, the SEC, I think of barbecue, which has a lot of local and regional traditions. I think of maybe sort of hunting culture, things of this nature, which I'm sure, preserve, beautiful aspects of a certain way of life. But in some sense, they're also aspects of mass culture and even consumer culture, especially as the Sun Belt has become such a booming, industrial region. So I'm curious, is there anyone, maybe with the exception of, a few obscure people kind of keeping this Southern tradition alive in the South today?
Yeah, it's tough because the South, as you note, has succumbed to mass culture. I really like the college football example because that is maybe you could say two things. One is that sports is the last dominant religious force in the United States. The second is that it's the last expression of true geographic identity and devotion to place. Where I live in Kansas, it's basketball. The University of Kansas basketball team means something to us in Kansas. When we lived in Georgia, the University of Georgia football team meant something to people in Georgia in a way that really transcended more secular concerns. It is an incredible expression of faith and devotion to a regional culture. When my wife and I moved to Georgia, a lot of people told us, oh, it's different down there. And we sort of thought, oh, yeah, it'll be fine. And you get down there, and it really is different down there. The South is still in many ways a distinct culture in everyday behavior. Things are just slower. You go to restaurants, and service is slower because people are just not in as much of a rush. But then at the same time, the flip side of that is as cities like Atlanta, Charlotte have become more global cities, they have lost a lot of what made them distinctive. When I first became friends with Peter Lawler, he told me that just a few years before we had moved to Rome, Georgia, where we lived, there had been a citywide referendum on whether or not to allow alcohol sales on Sundays. And Peter, who was so wonderful and was no stranger to a glass of wine, he said, I want to be able to buy wine on Sundays, but I also like the tradition that we have a Sabbath day where we cannot do regular things that makes that day distinctive from the other 6 days. And I thought that was such a neat expression of the Old South and the New South, because Peter wanted to be able to buy wine on Sundays. But those of us who think of ourselves as conservatives recognize that the idea of the Sabbath, of there being something special about that day that is out of time in some way, is very useful to culture. And it's no accident that throughout the Old South, the Sabbath day was maybe the day of the most family and community building of any day of the week. So that tension is there, and you're exactly right about that. But at least we still have college football, and they do love it.
I like that point about it, college football being the last sort of religious expression. When I was growing up, we had season tickets to University of Michigan football. And I remember at one point probably being like 13 or 14 years old and thinking, besides God, right, there is nothing that I love more in my entire life than the maize and blue. Like the walls of my room, like this was like the greatest spiritual experience that I had, and I would go with my grandfather and my uncle and my dad. And so it is, for all of I think there are some legitimate vices associated with college sports, basically, operating it as professional sports on a college campus. It is, maybe one of the only places where we have a genuine folk culture. So, yeah, I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, on the point you were talking about, McKay, about sort of maybe as things become more cosmopolitan or globalized, they start to lose their distinctness or their particularity. I think that's certainly true globally. Like we know that many thousands of languages, like sort of niche or more regional dialects and languages have died off for these like larger mother languages. German and English is much more spoken than I can't even think of some of the languages that have been lost. But I think Weaver would talk about that as a great loss. So I'm wondering, I guess, how much or what are some ways that we could seek to recover that particularity, or how much should we maybe resist or push against these globalizing, homogenizing tendencies?
Yeah, it's tough because when you live in the suburbs, as I do, you see the slow homogenization of all things, and Weaver called this the flattening of all distinctions. I think Alan Jacobs, the great scholar, calls it generica. This strip mall is just the same as the next strip mall, and things like that. Weaver would say and did say that paying attention to the local and what is closest to you is the strongest thing you can do to preserve culture. So I used to tell students that you should think of yourselves as being stewards in radiating circles of sympathy. I hope they are all blessed with spouses and children, and that would be the thing they would pay attention to first. You think of yourself first as a member of your family. After that, maybe you radiate outward to your block. I am a member of this block. Then it's neighborhood, then it's city, then it's state. Only then does it become the United States of America. And I think the problem is that we've sort of flipped that. We all know that national politics and the issues of national politics has come to dominate everything, even local issues. It is insane to me that city council candidates in various suburban municipalities here in suburban Kansas City are being asked about national political issues rather than when will the pothole be fixed on Mission Road or something like that. It takes effort to pay attention to what is closest to you when the temptation is always to pay attention to what is the loudest topic in the room. And it's that cultivation of attention that the Southern agrarians were so determined to preserve. That the more you get caught up in the abstract and move away from the tangible, the worse it is for culture, and frankly, the worse it is for your soul, a word that conservatives are rightly unafraid to use. The more you become caught up in pure abstraction, the worse society gets. I used to give the example to students, raise your hand if you're carrying a smartphone. Everyone raises their hands. And I say, okay, I have one too. These are all made up of what are called rare earth minerals, many of which are essentially mined by child slaves in Central Africa. And that we tend to not think about that because it's very far away. It's very abstract. And I said, if those rare earth minerals were being mined in front of the Verizon store, and when you go to get your new phone, you have to look into the eyes of a 14-year-old being forced at gunpoint to dig out rare earth minerals to power that smartphone, you might still buy the phone because it's convenient, but it's probably going to trigger something in your mind, some sort of guilt, because you are now closer to sources and consequences. If we all live next to the city dump, we would all think a little bit more about the trash we're generating. But I don't even know where our city dump is. I have no idea where our trash goes. So that's a source of real abstraction in my life and probably most of our lives. But in the Old South, that wasn't possible. If you were the small landholder, the small farmer, you were around sources and consequences all the time. You would grow your own food. The trash, the waste that you generated went into the field outside your house. So the more we can recapture paying attention to sources and consequences and moving away from abstraction, the better off our culture can be, according to Weaver.
McKay, I'm wondering if you could share a bit more about the book Ideas Have Consequences. That's a text that's been included in our honors program for many years. And I think one of the favorite, maybe conservative party tricks is to try to figure out where you think everything went wrong, at what point on the timeline. Enlightenment, Reformation, how far can you go back? And so What's Weaver's answer to that?
Yeah, it's a great conservative parlor game. Is where did we go off the rails? And with popular culture too. I just read Helen Andrews' great book Boomers, and we tend to think of the 1960s as the decade that everything falls apart. But the Beat Generation and Rebel Without a Cause and all these things are happening in the 1950s. So things are even falling apart then. For Weaver, the answer was William of Ockham and the doctrine of nominalism. Ockham is the great villain for this particular strain of conservatism, along with Bacon, Descartes, and Spinoza, who make up sort of a triumvirate of villainy, with occasional appearances by Rousseau and Condorcet. But Weaver comes down hard on the doctrine of nominalism because he believed that when we separated a term from the transcendental form underlying that term, that we lose our entire ontological leg to stand on. So if we could take something from our time, what is a marriage? Is it a traditional union of a man and a woman in a religious setting, something like that? Many of us would say, yes, that is a marriage. Is it the sort of latest, New York Times Thursday Styles piece about polyamory and something like that? A lot of our secular liberal peers would say, sure, that's a marriage, that's fine because they love each other. But if you go through the legacy of saying that things simply are what we feel at that particular moment, coming out of William of Ockham and severing that connection between underlying forms and terms, then you end up with things like the Obergefell decision in 2015. And regardless of what one thinks about the legalization of gay marriage, the logical chain is really quite nonsensical. The traditional rationale for marriage was really twofold in jurisprudence. It was love and it was procreation, and we want to encourage those two things. But once you reduce that to just love, you've really left yourself without a leg to stand on. Because I live in an upscale suburb, I'm surrounded by sort of the suburban liberals with the "in this house we believe" yard signs. And on that sign is always "love is love." And that's a wonderful sentiment. I would love to believe that love is always love. But if that household's 9-year-old daughter came home and said, "I love this 40-year-old man and we're going off to get married," the parents would say, "I don't think so." And so they don't believe that love is love. They do have some standard. They do still believe that some standard underlies that term love. But Weaver said that once we separate the underlying shared idea of a term from the term's use in culture, he said that results in what he called every man being his own priest and his own ethics professor. And it's a lot like the opening of Alasdair MacIntyre's After Virtue, where he says the situation we face is something like a nuclear bomb, where our entire moral language has been completely destroyed and we are left to pick up the pieces. Which is why debates over language in the contemporary United States are so powerful, because we know and have learned painfully throughout the 20th century that the group that controls the language is the group that controls power. And so once we are all free to define our terms however we wish, we have really set ourselves on a dangerous path. One of the great hilarious things for me in the 2016 presidential election, those of us at ISI and our students who move in the world of higher education know that for 60 years, the liberal elements in higher ed have been insisting that there is no such thing as truth. The truth is what I say it is at any time. It's my lived experience. It's my felt preference. And then suddenly a candidate comes along who says, yeah, there's no such thing as truth. Things are what I say there. They're all aghast and say, how could anyone say this? So someone finally comes along and acts upon their very ideas, and they're horrified. So that the shared sense of a common definition of terms is so essential to both cultural solidarity and to this view that Weaver is talking about. And that bad road started with William of Ockham. Okay,
I've been reading a lot out of the sort of the Straussian tradition for the Publius Fellowship that I'll be doing this summer. And so one of the things that he sort of points to is that the crisis of like modern social science is in turn predicated on, Descartes and Bacon, with the, modern natural science, which sort of has like their underlying theory of knowledge is like empiricism, and how all of this sort of culminates in a logical positivism. Thinking about the sort of the language question and all of that, what's the basis by which we would give definitions to terms or have this shared understanding? Because I think not only do people not agree on basic definitions, or even agree that there can be definitions that aren't stifling or oppressive, or when they do actually finally make a definition, if you disagree and you're doing it on a different basis, say a religious basis, or we had Professor Hadley Arcus on a few weeks ago, and he was talking about just the principles of common sense, that the sort of the first principles of moral and political reasoning. How do we, I guess, push back against the tyranny of modern scientific thinking? And what's the basis that Weaver and you would prescribe for understanding what these terms and how we actually can have a robust cultural agreement?
Yeah, it's really tough. And it's tough because the bigger a community gets, the harder it is to have shared terms. So maybe, Tom, your parish, when you go and interact with your fellow Catholics, you all generally agree that X means X because you all come out of the same tradition. But then if you go knock on the door of, let's say, the Episcopalian church down the block, and you say X means X, maybe they say, well, it means sort of X. And then we go a little bit farther down to the synagogue and say X means X, and they say rightly, well, we were here first, and X actually means Y. And then we go one block, down and knock on the Unitarians, and they say, no, there's no X. There's no X at all. So the larger we get, the harder it is to have these shared terms. The best antidote, according to Weaver, is to preserve cultural memory as much as possible and pass on what each generation has learned. And that's why families are so important to the Southern agrarian tradition and to the conservative tradition, because there is no greater means of preservation of knowledge, tradition, wisdom, and maybe most importantly, love, than the nuclear family. Bacon and these guys who are the villains of this story set us on this road of obsession with progress, which is probably, Weaver talked about God terms in society. Progress is probably the most powerful God term in American society today. And his mentor, John Crow Ransom, said the problem with this is there's no telos. It's almost anti-teleological. There's never progress toward a destination. It merely initiates the infinite series. If you ask my progressive neighbors, what are we progressing toward? There's really no answer. The answer is always more progress. So a failure to set a defining goal as a culture is what sets us on this path of scientism and logical positivism progress, which is essentially the social and scientific progress that eventually leads to the perfectibility of man. Whereas Weaver said, there are only two things we really know. He wrote this in his famous essay, Up from Liberalism, that we were given a universe that we did not create. It was given to us. We did not create it. And we don't understand very much of it. So there is a humility in the conservative mind, and Kirk talks about this a lot as well, that is a humility and a piety toward what has come before us. And the more you treasure what has come before us, the more you can make an attempt to have shared terms. So it is challenging to come to agreement on terms. And there will always be challenges, but the more we can preserve broad bases of shared cultural knowledge, the better off we will be. If I say to a person 50 years ago, if I use the house divided phrase, house divided itself cannot stand, maybe a lot of people would say, oh, sure, Lincoln. And maybe even today, a lot of people would say, okay, Lincoln, probably not as many as 50 years ago. But when Lincoln used the phrase house divided, probably most of his audience recognized it as an allusion to the Gospels. I think if we said it today and said, what do you associate with the phrase house divided? People would say, I think there was a president who said it, maybe. I would bet that very few people would say, oh, sure, it's the Gospels. And it would probably depend on the setting in which you were asking. But that's an example of a gradual erosion of shared cultural knowledge where we then fail to recognize the heritage that binds us together. So the better we can do on as local a level as possible, Weaver would say that's a step in the right direction.
McKay, I think that's the perfect note to end our conversation on today. So thank you so much for joining. And if readers or listeners want to follow your work or see some of your writings, where can they find that?
I have various essays at various places like the American Conservative and Front Porch Republic. But mostly if people are interested in these ideas, I just highly recommend students get involved with ISI, faculty members. ISI provides resources for lonely conservative faculty members, and I have been one, so I understand. And just, get involved in these books. ISI makes all these resources available to students, and the only way to start learning these things is to start learning these things. So get busy and get to work.
Great. Well, thank you all for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this podcast, head over to isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.